So today we're going to look at blades versus cavity backs. Blades often talked about as the preserve of only the tour players, only the best ball strikers. But how unforgiving are they? How much difference is there off centre to still a kind of player style head, but with a bit of forgiveness? We're going to test some data out, test some strike points, and see how unforgiving they really are. So what we're going to start with is we're going to look at centered strike, toe strike and heel strike, compare the two heads, and so we're going to hit one or two shots with each in each position, look at the data and really see where the differences lie. So we're going to start with the T100. So still a relatively, it's not perceived as the most forgiving head, but it's a head where we've got some tungsten heel and toe to give a little bit of off-center performance. So we've got the matching shafts, matching setup in terms of loft and everything. So pretty solid hit. Yeah, that's a solid contact. There's no point beating around the bush. That one's a good contact. Let's just tighten that up. I'm going to go straight to the blade for that. Following that one, that's a good strong hit. So one of the things that often people perceive as unforgiving is the top line. The blade has a really thin top line, which visually can intimidate somewhat, but actually the bit that you're hitting the ball with is the same size. But the top line's that much neater and cleaner and very, very thin, so there's not a lot of club head to look at from the top, but the face is the same size. So there's just as much club face to hit the ball with as there is on the T100. So going into the blade, one of the things you notice straight away is that's a more solid feel because the mass is more centered behind the contact rather than spread heel and toe. Feels there's a bit more guts to the strike. So if we compare good hit to good hit, now there is a very slight difference in terms of we're looking raw yardage, half a club. However, I did draw the T100 a little bit more. So that's brought the flight down somewhat. Proportionate launch and spin, 15 and 4,700, 16.951. The pitch of spin to launch is very similar. Efficiency wise, 1.38 from the blade, 143. So this is where there's a slight difference. The tungsten, if I grab the heads, the tungsten in the heel and the toe, that provides a little bit more density to the head. There is a little bit more energy transfer out of that. So where the mass is positioned here, taken out of the top and positioned right down the bottom, there's a little bit more momentum to the head, a little bit of a better energy transfer. So that's where some of a little bit of a distance gain on a forgiving head versus a blade comes from. But in terms of efficiency of hit, the blade still works pretty darn well. So that's on a center strike, about a half a club, but a few yards of that is the shot shape. So let's move to an off center hit. So I'm going to start off with one out the heel. So going back to the T100 here. The dreaded heel side miss. Now this will be a test of my ball striking because it gets relatively close to a shank, which none of us want to see. So let's see how much we lose catching this out of the heel. So what I'll try and do is get the same amount of a miss hit on each of the two heads, and as the diagram on the screen that we'll show you in a minute, that reel was very close to a shank, but very square club face, as that diagram shows. That was very nearly out the socket, so good to know I'm good at nearly hitting a shank when I want to. We'll do the same on the blade. So we'll do this hit and then we'll look at that data. So it'll be interesting to see how much, whether there's more loss of performance out of the blade. Now, interestingly enough, this is where potentially the blade might win. Marginally less out of the heel, or close to the hosel, but actually the sweet spot in the blade, because it's a solid lump of metal, is very slightly more to the inside of the head. So on a slightly heel side strike, actually we may see a little bit of a better performance out of the blade. So what we can see here, in terms of strike point, again, very close to the inside of the head. Efficiency 132, got a 165, so we still dropped 10 yards out of the shot. On the T100, a little bit more onto the heel, we've actually dropped off a little bit more. So, whether you could say strike point isn't exactly the same. I'm not a robot, so it's a marginal difference in strike point. But what we can certainly see is there's no more of a drop off on a heel strike out of a T100 forgiving head and out of a complete blade. Because of that center of mass being positioned a little bit more into the heel, we haven't got a heavy tungsten mass in the toe to drag that center of gravity outwards. The blade actually doesn't drop any performance versus the T100. If anything, it appears to be a little bit stronger in terms of performance off the face. Let's go to the toe side. This is where we're likely to see more of a difference. So we'll try and catch this a similar amount out of the toe. So the tech difference is we've got high density tungsten on the T100 and on most forgiving heads in the toe and the heel to spread the mass outside the middle of the face to give it stability off center and stop it twisting. So that extra density of material in the toe creates a little bit more momentum, means we should see less of a drop off on performance out of a toe strike on the T100. So let's see if I can catch this right out the toe. Nope, I've absolutely middled it. Let me give that one more. That's right out the middle. Yeah. So with where I stand to the ball, it's easier for me to hit it out the heel than it is out the toe. So let's give this a bit more room. Okay, that was a little bit more toe side. So that could feel, it's still very stable off center. You don't really feel a lot of distortion, whereas there are other heads, I think when we go to the blade, we're going to feel that head kick and twist a lot more. But you can really feel that head stay with the contact, much more so than out of the heel side. So now switching to the blade, I think we'll experience a very different feel from that, that kind of contact. So whilst we did lose a little bit of ball speed, I just didn't notice it very much. I think that's one of the biggest differences between a forgiving head and a blade. The blade you feel, as I'm about to, everything, whereas that T100, it didn't feel like a mishit. So, yeah, that's more toast. I can really feel on strike, because I haven't got that mass out the toe, keeping that momentum, stopping the head giving. With the centre of mass more in the heel than the toe side, this really, I could feel that head kick and give a lot more. So even if, it'd be interesting from a numbers point of view, even if I haven't dropped that much more performance, I felt like I dropped a lot more performance. I think that's a massive part of the difference between the blade and the forgiving head, is you feel everything out the blade. So interestingly enough, there's a couple I middled in between, but the ones I caught a little out the toe, there's only 2 yards difference in it, exactly the same club speed. There's a mile, an hour and a half ball speed difference. 120 miles an hour on the T100, 118.6 was exactly the same club speed out of the blade. So actually the change in performance, looking at spin, very similar, launched a hair higher out of the T100. The actual difference in drop off in performance, very similar. There's a hair more, but the difference is that the player experiences the twisting of the head a lot more. You feel it, you notice every little miss hit when you catch it toe side in particular. So it's very easy to feel like you're losing a lot more performance than between these two heads than you actually are. And so certainly heel side, there's pretty much parity between the two heads. If anything, the blade almost feels a little bit more solid, but the moment that strike moves to the toe side, the tungsten, the extra weighting in the toe of the head really holds that T100 head a little more solid through impact. You don't get that same sense of deflection that you do at the blade. And yes, there's a gain of a couple of yards, but that's all it is. So out of a heel and toe strike, it's the toe that you lose more out of on the blade, whereas actually the heel there's no massive gain on. So whilst the tech does do a certain amount, the numbers aren't quite as different as the feel. So if you are someone who wants to get as much feedback as possible and can actually, I guess, sort of deal with that side of, oh, I've mishit it, it's come up short, then that feedback might help you dial in your strike to find the centre of the face a bit more often. Whereas actually, if you're someone who doesn't want to know that they've mishit it, that's when the forgiveness really makes a big difference. But unless you're going to a really kind of solidly forgiving head, if I went up to say the T200, then there's tech in the face, then there's a much bigger distribution of weight, then we're really going to start to notice a difference. But if it's blade to sort of into the first elements of the player's cavity back heads, there aren't vast differences. So it's not as much as you might think, but you will just notice every single miss hit.